Now we want to create all these little carvings on the surface, and just like before, this will be nothing more than a bunch of layers driven by some masks. So this part will be actually more up to you. If you want, you can actually paint the old things on the UV. You can find a creative solution to make it fully procedural. My approach for it will be a mixed way. I will paint some basic shape and I will use some filter to edit the way I want. So first, let's organize things a little bit. Substance does have groups like Photoshop, so create one group, let's call it base metal, and we will drag all things we created so far inside the group. Now we want to split our view to 3D, 2D, so we will have the 3D viewport and also the UV view. This is convenient if you want to paint on UV and not on the 3D surface like we are going to do. So let's create another fill layer and it will be on top. Now, just for a second, let's create a black mask and let's add a paint layer. Now we can actually paint on the mesh or on the UV. But if we paint, let's say here, and then we want to add more variation to the carving itself, we will need to duplicate this mask for each layer of variation. We don't want to do it, so let's undo it until we have just the layer, and then we want to create another group. We will call this group Carve, and we will drag our new layer to the group. So now we can actually add the mask to the group itself. Let's say this layer will be our Carve base, then we will have our Carve variations. The reference mask will always be this one on the group, so we don't have to worry about duplicating the mask all over for each layer we need. So for now, let's delete this carve variation, and by selecting the mask, let's add a paint layer. We will start with the circle carvings. So as you can see, when you create a paint layer, you have different settings compared to a fill or a generator. You have the parameters to control the brush, you have the setting for your alpha, and also you can add a stencil to your paint layer. So what we want to do on the asset window, we want to switch to the alpha tab, and we want to use this circle crosshair shape. I have it right on top because I added to my favorite. As you can see, it has a star on it. If you right click on a shape, you can add it to your favorite shape here, and it will be placed right on top of that window. To look for this shape, you can just type circle crosshair and it will be there. As soon as you select a shape, it will be replaced as the alpha for your current brush. So on the viewport, you can see that we are using that shape to paint. So for the setting, let's see. We want to change the hardness to a full value of 1. And for the alignment, since we are working on the UV, we want to change the alignment to UV and the side space to viewport. Also, we want to enable the wireframe of our mesh so we can have some kind of reference on where to draw. Now for the shape itself, we want to decrease the border width. So let's say 0.02 for the first one. And let's try with 22 of scaling. So we have something like this. Now we just need to place it like this. And by the way, if you want to change the size of your brush, if you press Ctrl, you will have all the shortcuts available for the brush highlighted on the lower corner. And if you press Ctrl and right click to the right and the left, you will change the size of your brush. If you slide up and down, you will change the hardness of the brush, and doing the same operation with the left click, you will change the flow or the rotation of your brush. Now for the time being, let's change this base color to black on the carve base layer, so we will see it better. Back on the paint layer, we want to create the middle circle, so let's decrease the size to something like 16.5. And we want to increase the border a little bit because by scaling the brush, we are making the border smaller by default. So now we have the same thickness, more or less. And also we want to change the angle. So let's rotate it by 45 degrees. And let's place our middle circle let's say something like here. Now for the final one, we want to decrease the size even more. Let's try 11.5, 11.5. And again increase the border, this time to 0.06. We want to rotate it back again to 0. And let's place the final circle like this. Alright, so it's a little too thin for my taste, so I will redo it very quickly, starting with a bigger thickness. Alright, that's definitely better, so we can move on now. So now we want to create these little triangles on the border. So let's create another paint layer. And on the asset window, let's delete the circle filter and look for triangle. We want to use this basic one. And let's see, we want to draw it on the border, so here. And we want it to be rotated downward, so it will point here. For the sides, let's put 3.6, 3.6. So we will end up with something like this. And on the UV view, if you paint a single shape, then press Ctrl and Shift and click somewhere else, it will draw a straight line of those shapes. Of course, now the spacing is way too low, so we can increase it here. Let's put some height value like 300. Also Ctrl Z to delete the first shape, and let's draw it again. So the spacing is fine now, but we have to center it a little bit. So let's create a filter, because Substance between the filter does have the transform filter. So we can use it to move the layer underneath. But now we will end up with a huge problem, because as working in a layer-based environment, when we use an effect, it will affect all the layers underneath. That's one of the big limitations of layer-based software. So ideally, the solution would be to have separate mask for the circle, the triangle part, and these other parts that we are going to create later. But we can't have multiple independent masks on a single layer. Luckily for us, Substance does offer a feature called anchor points, and we can use that to fix our problem. So let's delete the transform filter and also the triangle. We're going to redraw it later. And basically we want to create a new fill layer that needs to be underneath the curve group, not inside but below. This will be our circle mask, so let's rename it to circle mask. Now we want to select the curve group mask, right click and say copy mask, so we can copy that mask and we can paste it here, right click, paste into mask. So now let's hide the curve group, and you can see that we have the same mask as before. Now on the effect of that mask, we want to click on the magic wand icon and say add anchor point. And let's don't call it circle mask, just circle mask. So now we can delete the circle from this one. Also, let's disable the circle mask and enable the curve group. We don't need to be anchor point visible, they can be hidden. And on the mask now we can add a fill layer. But instead of clicking here and giving him any fill layer, we want to go to anchor points and choose our circle mask. So same as before, but we are not using a paint layer on the curve group mask. Basically we created the mask before, and with the anchor point we say to Substance this needs to be a reference somewhere else. And that somewhere else is here on this fill layer of the curve group mask. So now we can create a new fill layer. This will be our triangle mask. Right click, add black mask, and add a paint layer to it. So now we can finally draw our triangles. We said sides of 3.6, 300 for spacing, and make sure you have the alignment on UV and side space on viewport. And we want it to be rotated 180 degrees, so it will point downward. and we can draw our line with Ctrl and Shift. So now if we add a filter and choose our transform node, it will affect only the triangles because it's on a separate layer. So let's center it a little bit better on the x-axis, something like, maybe it was already centered this time, alright. Either way, it's all good. So let's add a new paint layer, so we can press X, it will switch between black and white, and we can paint those extra bits out. Now we want to add another filter. This time we want to use another transform, and we want to offset it on the y-axis so we can cover the other borders. And we want to change the mode to add, so it won't replace the original shape, it just duplicates it. Now we want to do it another time, so it will take the last border and we can just copy and paste this effect. Of course, this in reality is duplicating both of the other borders, but since the offset is the same, the first one will be just overlap the previous one. So now we can hide this triangle mask just like we did for the circle one, and on the curve group we just want to add another fill. Let's choose anchor point. Oh, we didn't create the anchor point, so let's go back on the triangle mask, and on the layer stack let's just add an anchor point. Let's just call it triangle mask, and back on the curve group on the fill we have our anchor point on the list, so we can choose it here. Of course, now it's covering the previous layer, meaning the circle one, so let's change the mode to add. And we have both of our mask independent and together on the curve group. Now we want to do the same for those other pieces, so let's create a new fill layer. Let's call it piece mask. We want to add a black mask as always and a paint layer. So first we want to use this line double alpha. You can find it by typing line double. I have it on my favorites. And also, just for the moment, let's create a black layer so I can see better the dotted line of my brush here. So with this line double, let's see, we want to set a size of 8.5. We want it to be rotated, so it should be 90, yes. And let's place it somewhere like here. We are overlapping the center a little bit because we are going to use a mirror after, so we won't risk to have some gaps on the middle. And now let's see, we want to get rid of any alpha actually. We want to draw a straight line for now, so let's decrease the sides until we have a matching thickness, something like this. And let's draw a straight line. So let me switch to 2D only, so I have more room. Let's draw something like this. And we need to decrease the spacing, of course. Let's put it back to 0 or 5, which is the minimum. And let's draw something like this. And I believe it's too thick, so let's undo it and decrease the radius a little bit. It was 0.7, so let's try 0.65 and let's see what we will get. Yeah, it's better. Now we want to go down with the shape, so you can actually change the rotation with Ctrl left and dragging up and down. If you do it with Alt, you will rotate the canvas, and to restore it just press also Shift and it will be rotated with snapping, so you can reset it to the correct orientation. Now I will rotate my shape a little bit, something like this, so it will flow the topology, and let's draw something like this. Now we just want to close this line, so let's rotate it again, so something like this. Alright, now it's just a matter of cleaning up all these little gaps and extra bits we got, so let's do it. Alright, so we have something like this. Now we can add our mirror, so add the filter, and let's look for mirror. It should be here, mirror. We want to mirror it on the x-axis, but we don't want to be on the center of it, so let's change it until we have something like this. Let's see, maybe a little more, so 0.38, too much, 0.37, 0.36. Yeah, I believe it's good enough. Now, same as before, we want to add another filter to transform it and duplicate it. So let's put a transform and offset it until we have it on the second piece. Also change the mode to add, so we also have the original one. And let's Ctrl C and Ctrl V to duplicate it one more time. Maybe this time the offset is too much, so it's negative 0.18, so let's try negative 0.16. Let's hide it, the last one is way too much. Honestly, this slider of substance are not the best I've seen so far, so let's try negative 0.175. Yeah, and delete this transform and copy and paste this again. So now they looks the same. Finally, we want to add our anchor point. We will call it piece mask. Hide this layer, and on the curve group, let's add another fill with the last anchor point, piece mask. With the mode set to add, now let's switch to our 3D only view and let's hide this dummy layer. So now we have all the mask we need, and they come in 3 different fill layers, so they are also independent. Now we can go inside the curve group and we have the curve base layer and we can set it as we want. So for the base color, we want something orange, something like this, and we want to be carved in the surface. So let's decrease the overall height. Let's see, something like this. And we want to start with a relatively low roughness. So let's say 0.07 and something. Now, if we zoom in, you can see that the height is also considering the previous one coming from below. We don't want this to be like this. So to change this, you actually need to go on the group itself. So click on the group and we need to switch to the height layers. So this will be relative only to the height channel. And as you can see, the group is set to add as a mode. We want to set it as replace. So it will actually replace the height. It won't consider what's coming from underneath. And we want to do it also for the roughness. So we are sure that the value we set before for the base metal are not influencing the carving now. So let's go back to the base color layers, and on the curve base, we also are setting the metal back to 0. So the carving inside are not metal anymore, and we can disable the normal, of course. Also, we want to turn off the wireframe. And now, even if I like the overall shape I draw, this is too harsh and too neat, so we can add more filter to it to make it look better. So let's go back to the mask of the group, and after the anchor point, let's add some filters. First, we want to use another blur slope. And this time we want to set the intensity divider to 100. We will leave the blending mode to blur, and let's start to increase the amplitude a little bit. Let's say something like this. And maybe we can also lower the opacity of the overall effect. Let's say 7.5. Now add another filter, and we want to use a bevel. This is similar to a 3D bevel, but it's fake, of course. And we want to increase the distance to, let's say, 0.008, so it will be very small. And also increase the smoothing a little bit and lower the opacity to, let's say, 50. Now let's add another filter. This time we want a regular blur. Let's lower the intensity, let's say 0.2, and also the opacity to 50. So now we do have some smoother carving effect. and it's definitely better compared to what we have before. Now let's add some variation to the carving, so let's close this group mask and let's create another fill layer inside the carve group. For this one, let's disable metal and normal, and we want to choose another orange, maybe brighter than before, something like this. And we want to be more rough, so let's increase the roughness. Let's say 0.5, and I'm not sure about the height yet. Let's first create the mask, so right click, add black mask, and we start to add our fill. So for the first fill, let's use one of our clouds. Let's use this clouds tree. Let's alt click to visualize the mask, and let's see. We want to increase the scale to the maximum value. It will be 8. Now let's add a filter, and we want to use this contrast luminosity so we can decrease the overall brightness. Let's say negative 0.4. Now let's add another fill layer, and this time we want to use a dirt map, also filter here. Let's take this dirt one and let's increase the scale, maybe lower the balance a little bit, and increase the tiling to some height value, let's say like this, and we want to set it to add. So now press M to go back to the material. We have some variation on these carvings. But maybe this dirt effect is too strong, so we can decrease the overall opacity. Let's say something like 60. Alright. So back on the channel, let's see if we want to use also the height. Maybe some really low value, so let's say negative 0.005. Some very light value. Now, as a final thing on this material, we want to add a couple of dirt layers also on the carvings that will affect the overall surface. So let's create a new fill layer outside and on top of everything. Let's call it dirt moss. We will make it green like some moss or mold on the surface. So let's disable the normal, the metal will be 0, and we will have a relatively high roughness. We don't want to change the height, and for the color, let's take some green value. Let's say something like this. Now right click, add black mask, and start to add our fills. So for the first one, let's take this dirt one again. Let's alt click to visualize the mask, and let's increase the scale. We want to decrease the balance. Let's say something like this. Now let's mask it even more with another fill layer. We will set it to multiply. And let's look for another map. Let's say spot. We want to use this BNView spots too. So by default, it's something like this. We want to edit a little bit. Let's play with the disorder to mess it up. And let's set it back to multiply. So we are filtering those spots. Now press M, and we should have our green dirt here. You can see the difference. Now let's add another fill layer. Let's call it scratch. This will be some minor scratch that will only affect the roughness. So let's disable all the channel except the roughness and set the roughness to some value like 0.66 something. Now let's right click, add black mask, and add a fill layer. So here let's look for some scratches, and let's see, we want to use this grunge scratch dirty. So alt click, we have something like this, and we want to decrease the balance and set it as triplanar. Now let's add the levels to it, and let's lower the output maximum so we can clamp the bright values. Now let's press M, so we should have our new scratches added. Let's add another fill layer. This will be our final one, and it's also scratch. Let's call it scratch big. For this one, let's disable normal and metal. And let's create our black mask and add a fill layer. Here, let's see, we want to use this directional scratch. So drag it here and let's alt click to visualize it. So we want to lower the balance to have less of it. We want to set it as a triplanar like before. And on the noise parameter, let's increase the angle random to a full value of 1. And maybe play with the pattern a little bit. So we do have something like this. Now we want to add another fill. Let's take our spot again. So it was BN view spot 2. Here we want to lower the balance also. Let's say something like this. We want to increase the contrast. Set it to triplanar. And we will leave it as it is. We want to set it to multiply though. So we filter a lot of those scratches. Now on the channel, we want this to be decreased in height, so it will be carved inside the surface. And let's choose a middle gray value for the color, something like this. And for the roughness, let's increase it to a height value, let's say 0.9. So we do have some scratches, but we want to actually duplicate both of these filters. So let's Ctrl C and Ctrl V. And now for the upper copies, we want to change things a little bit. So on the directional scratch, let's play with the angle parameter. So they will all different. And also we want to play with the disorder. So it will have a different seeds. Same for the spots. Let's open the noise parameter and play with the disorder. So now we have two couples of layers working together, the first two and the second one, but right now the second scratch is covering the first one, so we need to change the mode to add. So we press M and we have our final scratch layer. And maybe it's too much of an height, so let's decrease it a little bit. Let's say something like this. So basically we done the first material. Now we need to take care of the size one and the emission one. Now before moving on the other materials, we want to change the environmental lighting. To do it, you just need to click on the display setting here and you have the environment map tab. If you click here, you will see all the maps that already comes with Substance, but let's say we want to use another map and we need to import it. Let's open the asset window, and here, as you can see, we have all the asset of Substance. We took our dirt map from here, and you will have also the materials, the alpha, the filter, and on the last tab, the environment. Now, to import a custom asset into Substance, you just need to click on the little plus icon here, and let's choose the resource we want to add. I want to use this Sepulchral Chapel Rotunda HDR. You can download it from HDRI event. So let's open it. And here we can set some keywords to find it in the asset window and also a category. On the import your resource, you have the option to import this asset only to the current session, to this project, or to the global library. So you will find it every time you will open Substance. Let's import it only for this project. And now you will find it here. We can drag it on the environment map channel. Let's close it. And now we have our new environment lighting. And the procedure is the same. If you want to import, let's say, an alpha, always go on the asset window, click on the plus icon and choose the asset you want to import.